If you have been sitting for longer than 45 minutes, the blood flow in your femoral artery, the artery supplying your leg, has already dropped. Not because your heart is pumping less, because the blood vessel itself has changed. The single-cell layer lining the artery has reduced its production of the molecule that keeps the vessel open, and the artery has partially constricted. Your blood is moving slower through a narrower pipe. This is happening in your legs right now if you've been sitting for the last hour. And it began before you felt anything. Damage reverses in 5 minutes of standing. It returns in 45 minutes of sitting. The cycle repeats every time you sit down, every day, for the rest of your life. What follows is the physics of why. Starting with an organ you have never seen, cannot feel, and have probably never been told you possess. There is a layer of cells lining every blood vessel in your body, every artery, every vein, every capillary. A single layer, one cell thick, covering the entire interior surface of your vascular system. If you removed every one of these cells and laid them flat, they would cover approximately 5,000 square meters, roughly the area of a football pitch. This layer is called the endothelium. It is not inert plumbing. It is a metabolically active organ, the largest organ in your body by surface area, larger than your skin, that continuously produces compounds regulating your blood vessel diameter, your blood clotting, your inflammatory state, and the permeability of your vessel walls. No physician has ever pointed to this organ on a diagram and told you what it does. It does not appear on anatomical charts the way the heart or lungs do. It has no shape. It is a surface, not a structure, distributed across every vessel in your body, invisible to imaging, too thin to feel, too dispersed to locate. And yet it is the organ whose function determines whether your arteries remain open and flexible or narrow and inflamed. Every cardiovascular event, every heart attack, every stroke, every peripheral artery occlusion begins with a failure of the endothelium. The organ you have never seen is the organ that stands between you and the disease that kills more humans than any other cause on earth. Single most important compound the endothelium produces is nitric oxide. In arteries, endothelial nitric oxide is produced by an enzyme called endothelial nitric oxide synthase, eNOS. Its primary function is vasodilation, relaxing the smooth muscle in the artery wall, increasing vessel diameter, increasing blood flow, and reducing the resistance your heart must pump against. Nitric oxide is also anti-inflammatory. It suppresses the adhesion molecules that attract immune cells to the artery wall, and it inhibits platelet aggregation that initiates clot formation. The molecule that keeps your arteries open is the molecule that keeps them healthy. One molecule does both jobs. eNOS is activated by shear stress, the frictional force of blood flowing across the endothelial surface. When blood flows at normal velocity, shear stress on the endothelium is approximately 15 to 30 dynes per square centimeter. This level of shear activates eNOS, maintaining continuous nitric oxide production, keeping the artery dilated, supple, and anti-inflammatory. The activation is mechanical. The endothelial cell physically deforms under the flow, and the deformation triggers the enzyme. Every step you take, every time your calf muscles contract and push blood through your leg arteries, the flowing blood creates friction on the endothelial surface. The cells deform, eNOS activates, nitric oxide is produced, and the artery remains in its protective state. When blood flow decreases, as it does during prolonged sitting, when the legs are motionless and the calf muscle pump is inactive, shear stress drops below the activation threshold of eNOS. Nitric oxide production falls. The artery constricts. The anti-inflammatory protection disappears. The very signal that keeps your arteries healthy, flowing blood creating friction on the vessel wall, is the signal that sitting removes. Now, what happens to that signal at 45 minutes? Because the measurement exists, and the speed of the damage is the part nobody expects. Posar and colleagues at Indiana University published the most direct measurement of what sitting does to leg artery function over time. They used flow-mediated dilation, the gold standard test of endothelial function, to measure the femoral artery's ability to dilate in response to a blood flow stimulus. After sitting continuously for 1 hour, flow-mediated dilation was reduced by approximately half. The artery had lost roughly half of its vasodilatory capacity in 60 minutes of immobility. The reduction was detectable as early as 30 minutes. By 3 hours, the reduction had not worsened significantly beyond the 1-hour measurement. The damage plateaus quickly and persists until movement resumes. Intervention that prevented the decline: standing and walking for 5 minutes after every 30 minutes of sitting completely preserved endothelial function. 5 minutes every half hour. That was sufficient to maintain the shear stress that keeps enos active and the artery responsive. A single hour of sitting measurably damages the lining of your leg arteries, not theoretically, not over months. Measurably, in 1 hour, confirmed by ultrasound. 5 minutes of walking every 30 minutes completely prevents it. The damage is fast. The prevention is simple. The gap between the two, the hours you sit without standing, is where cardiovascular risk accumulates. Consider what that means for the way you spent yesterday. If you sat for 2 hours watching television without standing, your femoral artery spent approximately 90 minutes in a state of reduced vasodilatory capacity. Nitric oxide production suppressed, artery partially constricted, anti-inflammatory protection diminished. If you then stood, walked to the kitchen, made tea, and sat down again for another 2 hours, the cycle restarted from the beginning. Each sitting bout that exceeds 45 minutes produces the endothelial suppression. Each standing interruption reverses it. The question is not whether you exercised yesterday. The question is how many uninterrupted sitting bouts exceeded 45 minutes, because each one produced a measurable period of vascular vulnerability that exercise at a different time of day does not retroactively correct. Well, and the endothelial damage is only the first system that sitting suppresses. Because there is an enzyme in your muscle capillaries that clears fat from your blood, and sitting switches it off through a mechanism that has nothing to do with calories. In 2003, Mark Hamilton at the Pennington Biomedical Research Center published a finding that shifted the understanding of sedentary physiology. Hamilton's research across animal and human inactivity models documented that prolonged inactivity reduces the activity of lipoprotein lipase, LPL, in skeletal muscle by up to 90% within hours. LPL is the enzyme anchored to the capillary walls of your muscle tissue that breaks down circulating triglycerides into fatty acids and glycerol, allowing muscle to use fat as fuel. When LPL activity drops, circulating triglycerides accumulate in the blood. The triglyceride elevation that cardiovascular risk models use to predict heart disease. Mechanism is not caloric. It does not depend on how much you ate. It depends on whether the muscle is contracting. LPL requires muscular contraction to maintain its activity. Sitting eliminates contraction. Contraction ceases. LPL drops. Triglycerides rise. The pathway is mechanotransduction, your muscle's contractile state directly regulating an enzyme's activity at the capillary wall. Hamilton's key insight, standing still, not exercising, just standing, maintains LPL activity. Sitting eliminates it. The difference between standing still and sitting still, a metabolic expenditure difference of only 10 to 20 calories per hour, produces a 90% difference in the enzyme activity that clears fat from your blood. The threshold is not energy balance. It is the mechanical state of the muscle, loaded or unloaded, contracting or slack. Your body does not track calories for this pathway. It tracks whether the muscle is bearing weight. Think about what that means for the person over 65 whose doctor has noted elevated triglycerides. The dietary advice: eat less fat, reduce processed foods, increase fiber, addresses the input side of the triglyceride equation. The sitting question addresses the clearance side. Triglycerides in your blood are not only a function of what you ate, they are a function of whether the enzyme that clears them is active, and that enzyme is controlled by whether your muscles are contracting, not by whether your diet is clean. A person eating an excellent diet who sits for 8 hours has suppressed LPL activity for 8 hours. A person eating an identical diet who stands every 30 minutes has maintained LPL activity throughout the day. The triglyceride profiles of those two people will differ, not because of food, but because of furniture. Implication is not that diet does not matter, it does. The implication is that the clearance mechanism has been overlooked. Two people with identical diets, identical genetics, identical body compositions can present with different triglyceride levels based on their daily sitting pattern. The person who sits in 90-minute blocks will show higher circulating triglycerides than the person who interrupts sitting every 30 minutes. Because the enzyme that clears triglycerides from the blood requires muscular contraction to remain active, and the person who sits for 90 minutes has had that enzyme suppressed for the majority of the sitting period. And then, what happens to your blood sugar when the muscle stops contracting? Because insulin sensitivity has its own sitting pathway, and it operates through a different mechanism that produces an equivalent vulnerability. Skeletal muscle is responsible for approximately 80% of insulin-mediated glucose uptake in your body. The good-for glucose transporter, the protein that moves glucose from the blood into muscle cells in response to insulin, is translocated to the cell surface by two independent signals, insulin binding to its receptor and muscle contraction. During sitting, the contraction signal is absent. Good-for translocation depends entirely on the insulin signal. The muscle becomes less responsive to an equivalent insulin concentration. Insulin sensitivity decreases. Dunstan and colleagues published in Diabetes Care in 2012 that interrupting sitting with 2-minute bouts of light intensity, walking every 20 minutes, reduced postprandial glucose and insulin levels by 24 to 30% compared to uninterrupted sitting. Meal was identical. Insulin production was identical. Different glucose clearance. Entirely explained by the presence or absence of intermittent muscular contraction maintaining GLUT4 translocation. If your doctor has noted rising fasting glucose, borderline HbA1c, or early insulin resistance, the conversation has probably been about diet, about medication, about exercise 3 times a week. The sitting question is rarely asked. But the metabolic system that processes your blood sugar performs measurably differently depending on whether you stood up every 30 minutes or sat continuously. Blood sugar problem may be partly a sitting problem, not dietary, not genetic, positional. The muscle that should be clearing glucose from your blood is not contracting, and the transporter that should be moving glucose into the muscle cells is not being activated by the contraction signal it was designed to receive alongside the insulin signal. Your body was engineered to process glucose with 2 signals operating simultaneously, insulin and contraction. Sitting removes one of the 2 signals. The system still works on one signal alone. It works less efficiently. Insulin has to do the work of 2 signals by itself. The pancreas compensates by producing more insulin. The muscle becomes progressively less responsive to each unit of insulin. The clinical definition of insulin resistance. The resistance is not a disease that arrived. It is a mechanical consequence of removing one of 2 inputs the system was designed to receive. A person who sits for 3 hours after lunch is processing that meal with 1 signal, insulin alone. A person who stands and walks briefly every 30 minutes after lunch is processing that meal with both signals, insulin and contraction. Dunstan's 24 to 30% improvement in postprandial glucose clearance is the difference between 1 signal and 2. The meal was identical. The pancreas was identical. The number of signals reaching the GLUT4 transporter was not. You see 3 independent systems damaged by 1 behavior: endothelial nitric oxide production suppressed by reduced shear stress, LPL activity eliminated by muscle inactivity, GLUT4 translocation impaired by absent contraction signal. 3 mechanisms, 3 pathways, 3 consequences: vascular constriction, triglyceride accumulation, glucose dysregulation, all produced by sitting, all reversed by standing. The convergence is not coincidental. It reflects a body that was engineered for continuous low-level movement and that treats stillness as an abnormal input. timeline of the damage is what makes the convergence clinically significant. Endothelial function begins deteriorating at 30 minutes. LPL activity drops within hours. Insulin sensitivity decreases measurably within a single sitting bout. All three systems begin failing in the first hour of uninterrupted sitting. Not the first month, not the first year, the first hour. And all three systems recover within minutes of standing and walking. The speed of both the damage and the recovery tells you something about what the body expects. A system that deteriorates in 45 minutes and recovers in 5 was not designed for prolonged stillness. It was designed for intermittent movement with brief rests, the activity pattern of every terrestrial mammal except the one that invented the chair. Endothelium, lipase, glucose transporter, 3 metabolic systems, 1 mechanical input. There is a fourth system, not metabolic but mechanical. That explains why the legs are where the damage concentrates. Now, the pump in your calves that functions as a second heart and that sitting switches off. Venous system of your legs returns blood to the heart against gravity. The driving force is not the heart. Arterial pressure has been spent by the time blood reaches the venous side of the capillary bed. Driving force is the calf muscle pump, the gastrocnemius and soleus muscles compressing the deep veins of the lower leg with each contraction, pushing blood upward through one-way venous valves. This pump generates the venous pressure required to return approximately 70% of your blood volume from below the heart. During sitting, the calf muscle pump stops. Blood pools in your lower leg veins. Venous pressure at the ankle rises from approximately 25 millimeters of mercury during walking to 90 during sitting. Increased venous pressure forces fluid out of the capillaries into the interstitial tissue. Your legs swell. Endothelial cells in the distended veins are subjected to abnormal stretch forces that trigger inflammatory signaling. Pooled blood is also at risk for clot formation. Virchow's triad. The 3 conditions that promote thrombosis include stasis, endothelial injury, and hypercoagulability. Prolonged sitting provides all 3 simultaneously. Stasis from the inactive calf pump. Blood pooling in the deep veins with no mechanical force pushing it upward. Endothelial injury from abnormal venous stretch. The vein walls distending under the weight of the pooled blood column. The endothelial cells deforming beyond their design range. Hypercoagulability from the inflammatory signaling the stretch produces, the distended endothelium releasing clotting factors and inflammatory mediators that increase the blood's tendency to coagulate. Deep vein thrombosis. Blood clots in the deep veins of the legs is epidemiologically linked to prolonged sitting in aircraft, at desks, and in cars. The physics is fluid dynamics in a gravity-dependent system with a pump that only operates when the muscle contracts. Your calf muscles are the pump. Sitting turns the pump off. The fluid pools. The clotting risk rises. If you have ever arrived after a long car journey with swollen ankles, heavy legs, and stiff calves, you are experiencing the calf pump shut down directly. The swelling was interstitial fluid that the venous system could not return to the heart because the pump was off for hours. The heaviness was your legs carrying the weight of pooled blood that should have been returned to the circulation. The stiffness was the venous congestion pressing on the muscle tissue itself. Standing and walking for 5 minutes after arrival. The relief you felt, the lightness returning to the legs, the swelling beginning to subside. Was the calf pump restarting? Venous pressure dropping from 90 back toward 25 millimeters of mercury. Pooled blood being pushed upward through the venous valves toward the heart. The relief was not psychological. It was hydraulic, a pump restarting after hours of inactivity, the pressure normalizing, the fluid returning to where the circulatory system designed it to be. And then, what accumulates in the artery wall when the blood stops flowing properly? Because the inflammatory cascade that sitting triggers is the initial step in the disease process that kills more humans than any other. Endothelial cells, subjected to low shear stress, the condition of prolonged sitting, undergo a phenotypic shift. They increase expression of adhesion molecules on their surface, VCAM1 and ICAM1, which attracts circulating monocytes to the artery wall. They increase production of reactive oxygen species, which oxidize LDL cholesterol in the subendothelial space. They decrease production of nitric oxide, which normally suppresses both inflammation and platelet aggregation. The artery wall, deprived of the protective shear stress that flowing blood provides, becomes actively pro-inflammatory. This is the initial step in atherosclerosis, the formation of fatty plaques in artery walls that narrow, rupture, and cause heart attacks and strokes. Process is not driven by cholesterol alone. It is driven by the inflammatory state of the endothelium, which is driven by shear stress, which is driven by blood flow velocity, which is driven by whether you are sitting or standing. Cholesterol is the material. Inflammation is the process. Sitting provides a trigger. Not the only trigger, as hypertension, diabetes, smoking, and genetic lipid disorders all independently produce endothelial inflammation. But a trigger that operates every time blood flow drops below the shear stress threshold, in every artery, in every person who sits for longer than 45 minutes. The artery disease that kills more humans than any other cause on Earth has a mechanical component, and the mechanical input is whether your blood is flowing fast enough to keep the endothelium in its protective state. That connection, arterial disease beginning not with cholesterol, but with the loss of shear stress that immobility produces, the endothelium switching from protective to inflammatory phenotype because the blood stopped moving fast enough, reframes what cardiovascular disease is, because it means the disease is not only about what is in the blood, it is about whether the blood is moving. The endothelium does not care about your cholesterol level if the shear stress is adequate. It produces nitric oxide, suppresses the adhesion molecules, prevents the monocytes from entering the wall. It becomes vulnerable to your cholesterol when the shear stress drops. When the nitric oxide disappears, the adhesion molecules appear, the monocytes arrive, and the LDL oxidation begins. Your arteries are not passive pipes that clog over time like plumbing. They are active organs that maintain themselves through a shear stress-dependent signaling cascade. And every hour you sit without standing, that maintenance system shuts down. The cholesterol in your blood is present whether you sit or stand. The endothelial protection that prevents it from entering the artery wall is present only when the blood is flowing fast enough to maintain shear stress. The sitting creates the vulnerability. The cholesterol exploits it. The 45-minute interruption restores the protection. Now, the mortality data. Because the population-level evidence confirms what the bench science predicts, and the comparison it produces is the part most people resist. Kaczmarzyk and colleagues published a study of over 17,000 Canadians followed for 12 years. After adjusting for physical activity level, smoking, and alcohol consumption, sitting time was independently associated with all-cause and cardiovascular mortality. Those in the highest quartile of daily sitting time had approximately 50% higher mortality risk than those in the lowest quartile, independent of whether they exercised. That finding deserves repetition, independent of whether they exercised. A person who exercises for 30 minutes daily and then sits for 10 hours has a higher mortality risk from the sitting than they offset with the exercise. The sitting damage and the exercise benefit operate through different physiological pathways. Exercise improves cardiovascular fitness, builds muscle, increases VO2 max, long-term adaptations that operate over weeks and months. The sitting damage operates through acute pathways: endothelial suppression, LPL elimination, insulin resistance, that activate within 45 minutes and resolve within 5 minutes of standing. Exercise at 7 in the morning does not prevent the endothelial damage that accumulates during a 3-hour sitting bout at 2 in the afternoon. The protection is not cumulative in that direction. Each sitting bout is a separate insult. Each standing interruption is a separate intervention. Exercise and sitting interruption are complementary, both beneficial, neither a substitute for the other. If you exercise regularly and consider yourself physically active, the sitting question is still relevant. Your morning walk does not protect your femoral artery from the afternoon sitting bout. Your evening gym session does not reverse the LPL suppression that accumulated during the day. The exercise improves your long-term cardiovascular capacity. The sitting interruptions protect your acute vascular function. Both matter. Neither replaces the other. Mortality risk associated with sitting more than 6 hours per day is comparable in magnitude to the risk associated with smoking. The comparison is epidemiological. The hazard ratios are in a similar range for all-cause mortality. It is not mechanistic. Smoking causes specific diseases through specific carcinogenic pathways that sitting does not. The comparison holds in the mortality data. It does not hold in the disease specificity. This is the comparison most people resist. Because sitting feels passive, feels safe, feels like the absence of harm rather than the presence of harm, rather than the presence of it. Smoking is an action you choose to perform. Sitting feels like inaction. The default state, what happens when you are not doing anything. But the endothelium does not distinguish between actions and inactions. It responds to shear stress. When the stress is adequate, it produces nitric oxide, suppresses inflammation, maintains vascular health. When the stress drops, it switches to the inflammatory phenotype that initiates atherosclerosis. The endothelium responds to physics, not to intention. The resistance to the comparison runs deeper than skepticism about the data. Smoking is stigmatized. Sitting is normal. Smoking is a behavior you can stop. Sitting is embedded in the architecture of modern life. Chairs in waiting rooms, seats in theaters, sofas in living rooms, car seats on every journey. The person who smokes can quit. The person who sits cannot eliminate sitting, but they can interrupt it. The intervention is not the elimination of sitting. It is the interruption of sitting. 45 minutes, then stand. The endothelium does not need you to stop sitting. It needs you to stop sitting continuously. 45 minutes, then stand. 5 minutes, then sit. The ratio protects the organ. Well, and the research converges on a number. Because the practical question is not whether sitting is harmful, that is established, but how often you need to interrupt it for the protection to hold. Endothelial function, LPL activity, and insulin sensitivity all begin to deteriorate between 30 and 60 minutes of uninterrupted sitting. No single study establishes 45 minutes as the threshold. The data ranges from 20 to 60 minutes across different endpoints. 45 minutes is a practical synthesis, long enough for a productive television episode, a focused reading session, a conversation, a meal, within the window where most measured damage has begun, but before it reaches its full extent. Intervention is not exercise. It is interruption. Standing up, walking for 2 to 5 minutes, allowing the calf muscle pump to reactivate, allowing shear stress to restore ENOS activity, allowing muscular contraction to reactivate LPL and maintain GLUT4 translocation. The walk does not need to be brisk. It does not need to elevate heart rate. It needs to load the muscles and move the blood. Standing alone maintains LPL activity. Walking adds the shear stress restoration and the calf pump reactivation. Studies of sitting interruption consistently report that the protective effect of standing and walking for 5 minutes persists through the subsequent sitting bout. The endothelium maintains its vasodilatory capacity, LPL remains active, GLUT4 translocation continues to respond to both signals. The 5-minute interruption is not a reset that gradually degrades. It is a maintenance input that the system needs at regular intervals to remain in its protective state. The interval is approximately 45 minutes. The input is approximately 5 minutes of standing or walking. The ratio, 45 minutes of productive sitting for every 5 minutes of standing, is the operating specification of a vascular system that was designed for continuous movement and that tolerates sitting only in intervals. What this looks like in practice, a television program, is 45 to 60 minutes. Stand at the credits. A reading session can be interrupted by walking to refill a cup of tea. A conversation can continue while standing. The interruption does not need to break the activity. It needs to break the sitting. The endothelium does not require exercise. It requires shear stress. Standing and walking for 5 minutes restores the shear stress. The activity you were doing before and after the interruption is unchanged. The vascular protection is restored. The trade is 5 minutes of standing for 45 minutes of protected sitting. That convergence, endothelial function, lipid metabolism, glucose regulation, venous return, and inflammatory signaling all deteriorating on one timeline and all reversing with one 5-minute intervention, is the convergence that closed the argument for me in the sedentary physiology literature. Because it means the 45-minute rule is not a health tip. It is the mechanical operating condition of the organ that stands between you and the disease that kills more people than anything else on earth. Endothelium is the largest organ you have never seen. 5,000 square meters of living tissue lining every vessel in your body, producing the nitric oxide that keeps your arteries open, your blood flowing, and your inflammatory balance in check. It runs on one signal, shear stress, the friction of blood moving across its surface. Every time you sit for longer than 45 minutes without standing, that signal drops below the threshold that keeps the system working. The damage is measurable within 30 minutes. It is reversible within 5 minutes of standing. You have been sitting while listening to this. If it has been longer than 45 minutes, the endothelial suppression is present in your femoral artery right now. Stand up. Walk for 5 minutes. The endothelium needs the flow.